Hello again, and thanks for joining us for this Sunday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm meteorologist David Percy. And up first, a hazardous weather graphic. Blizzard warning continues for the eastern Arctic coast there, Kaktovik Barter Island area. And that's out until midnight tonight for east winds gusting to 60 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions in areas. And then a winter weather advisory there for Prudhoe Bay zone on the just to the west of the blizzard warning. That's a winter weather advisory for snow and blowing snow, maybe an inch of snow falling at the most additional, but winds gusting to 50 miles an hour, creating visibilities less than half a mile at times in some areas. Then the wind advisory for the Alaska Range continues until 6 p.m. this evening for winds gusting to 50 miles an hour, mainly through the passes. And that's it for watches, warnings, and advisories. Moving on to satellite imagery, and see continued south to north flow of moisture, although it's a narrowing band as the frames wear on there, as you can see, coming up on the western side of a huge ridge of high pressure, bringing warm conditions into British Columbia and also into the southern central panhandle today. Temperatures in the 60s. In fact, one area had 70 degrees at 3 o'clock this afternoon down there. And otherwise, clouds, showery conditions to the west of that boundary there across south central Alaska, with some clearing periods as well, some sun breaks, Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula today, and also up over the Tanana Valley around Fairbanks is to the west of that band of clouds. You can see it extends all the way up to the Arctic coast and then spills into Mackenzie Bay. And out to the west, kind of a weak cyclonic curvature or rotation of the clouds there, just north of the central Aleutians. That's a weakening low pressure area out there and keeping it unsettled and damp, the surface low in closer to the coastline. On the chart today, actually the low center is in over Bristol Bay. The trough there actually seeing the circulation aloft in the higher clouds out just north of the central Aleutians. They're passing across the Pribilos, so some shower activity there. Showers over the Alaska Peninsula and isolated scattered showers in the Aleutians. Otherwise, areas of precipitation, mostly showery behind that front. Light rain at times, Kodiak Island. A little heavier precipitation along the North Gulf Coast, but that's letting up. Not much north of the Alaska Range, and then some areas of snow over the northern interior. And again, sunshine breaking out over the central and southern southeast coast. Petersburg reached 70 degrees at 3 o'clock this afternoon. And Klawock had 67, while Ketchikan 65 degrees. Otherwise, for tonight, look for some rain to move into the Panhandle with a weakening trough there. That front just washes out into a trough. That'll bring a chance of rain down over the southern southeast coast. Periods of light rain for the North Coast, North Gulf Coast, showers or light rain at times. Low pressure up along the southwest coast kind of splits off there. One weaker center moving toward Kodiak Island, keeping it cloudy with some light precipitation there. Mixed rain and precipitation, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta into the Alaska Range. Areas of light snow or snow showers over the western and northwest part of the state with some flurries and fog along the Arctic coast. And winds will be diminishing, especially after midnight up there. And those the warning and watch should end. Again, it's out until midnight, after which it'll most likely end. And then the forecast for Monday, again, not much change. Low pressure controlling the western interior with some of that spilling into the central interior. Some light snow showers or rain and snow showers. Copper River Basin up to the Alaska Range. Tanana Valley, mid and upper Tanana Valley, 40-mile country, Yukon Flats, mostly dry and still some clearing. It starts to dry out again over the southern panhandle. Showers linger in the north there, and chance of light snow, fog, or flurries for the western Arctic coast. And then you can see out to on the left-hand side and at the bottom of the picture, the tightening gradient there ahead of the next two pretty potent systems. That front out bringing storm force winds into the western Bering Sea and the western and central Aleutians. Actually starting in the western Aleutians late Monday night and early Tuesday, and then pushing to the central Aleutians in the afternoon. And then a very tight pressure field around that 962 millibar low, that'll spread gale force winds up to the North Gulf Coast, the Southeast Coast, and Kodiak Island during the afternoon hours, with even gale warnings pushing into southern Cook Inlet during the afternoon, with rain on the increase, moderate to heavy at times for the Panhandle, Kodiak Island, increasing rain on the North Gulf Coast. Otherwise, just some scattered rain or snow showers, mostly along the Alaska Range mountainous terrain of the Alaska Peninsula. Lows tonight in the 50s for the Panhandle, 30s, upper 20s, some areas, mostly in the 30s to near 40, the remainder of interior Alaska. Kodiak Island mid-40s, same thing for Homer. Seward 41, highs tomorrow in the 40s to near 50 for Homer, 51 for Kodiak. A little cooler with that trough coming through, weakening front, more clouds, but still some areas pushing 60 over the southern southeast coast. High or lows Tuesday morning in the 40s for the Panhandle. Upper 20s to upper 30s, south central Alaska, lower 40s Kodiak Island, highs lower 50s for Kodiak, near 60 again for the southern Panhandle, lower 50s to the north. Mid to upper 40s or mid 40s for south central Alaska, Susitna Valley, and mid 40s Bristol Bay up to the north. Lows teens and 20s tonight, and highs tomorrow 30s to near 40 around Fairbanks, 43 say for North Pole and Delta Junction area, with lows in the 20s. Teens in the Brooks Range, followed by highs in the 30s, again to near 40 in some areas, otherwise 20s for the Arctic coast. Out to the west, lows in the 30s tonight, just about everywhere, and highs tomorrow in the 40s, just about everywhere out there. Mid 30s for St. Lawrence Island, followed by lows Tuesday morning, upper 30s to near 40 for the Alaska Peninsula, upper 30s for the Central Aleutians, 43 for Shimiatu, mid 30s for the Pribilofs, mid 30s Southwest Coast. And highs in the mid-30s for St. Lawrence Island, otherwise 40s to lower 50s for the Aleutians, lower 40s for the Pribilofs, near 40 for the Southwest Coast, mid-30s St. Lawrence Island.
Good afternoon, Southeast Alaska. I'm meteorologist Caleb Cravens here to give you your 5-day outlook. For today, we've actually been seeing decent weather across the Panhandle as we've been in a break from this active pattern, and even some areas have been seeing some sunshine. But as we go into Monday, that's going to quickly change as we have another round of systems moving in. Taking a look at Ocean Prediction Center, we actually have a hurricane force low forecasted to enter the Gulf of Alaska on Tuesday. And then by Wednesday, it will be decreasing to a storm force low and tracking towards the Icy Bay area. But as it does so, we will be seeing impacts across the Panhandle. Some of those include strong winds across the Panhandle, so seeing gusts of 40 miles per hour. Through the inner channels, we're looking at small crafts, 25 knots to 34 knots, even gale force through the northern inner channels where we could see some 35 knot winds Wednesday afternoon. Now, as far as the Gulf Coast is concerned, widespread gales are likely with actually seeing some storm force winds along the offshore as well. We also are going to see very high seas, with seas anywhere from 35 to 40 foot seas. Now this system is going to travel through the Panhandle through Wednesday, and it's going to bring some heavy rain as well as these windy conditions. We're looking at 2 to 4 inches across the Panhandle with lesser amounts across the southern Panhandle. Now Thursday, it starts all over again. So that system moves out and enters the Yukon, and we have a new low that enters the northern Gulf on Thursday, bringing another round of moderate to heavy rain, and that will continue through Friday. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned as we continue to monitor this very active weather pattern going into this week, and look for updates at weather.gov/Juneau and on our social media sites at NWS Juneau. Thank you.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And on to flying weather. First graphic for Monday morning, IFR, Brooks Range out to the Arctic coast, and IFR, Northern Bering Sea, Southern Seward Peninsula, Yukon Delta Coast, and St. Lawrence Island. Marginal VFR for the Eastern Bering Sea and from Atka Island to Bristol Bay. VFR, AKwx westward, and some IFR in Chillicothe Strait up across the southwest interior, Kuskokwim Valley, IFR right up north to the Yukon, and also along the Alaska Range, all IFR there. And down in the Manuska, Susitna Valley, Northern Cook Inlet, North Gulf Coast, and the Panhandle, IFR. And for the afternoon, area VFR opens up in the greater Fairbanks area, the greater Fairbanks area, and IFR from the Talkeetnas, western Copper River Basin, right on down into Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast to Yakutat, becomes VFR across the southeast coast. And VFR, or IFR, Southern Cook Inlet, Western Alaska Range into the Kuskokwim Valley, and some IFR there, Northern Bering Sea, Yukon Delta to Kotzebue. Eastward there across Selawik, Kobuk, Northern Koyukuk Valley to the Yukon Flats. A little bit of IFR for the Central Arctic Coast. VFR, Western Central Aleutians, marginal VFR, Eastern Bering Sea to the Alaska Peninsula. Then we've got VFR Tuesday morning from Kiska Island eastward to about False Pass and Western Alaska Peninsula. IFR coming in with the next system into Shimianat-2 in the morning hours. IFR over the interior, IFR for the eastern North Gulf Coast and southern Prince of Wales Island. Otherwise, mostly marginal for the Panhandle. Scattered marginal VFR with scattered VFR, Northern Cook Inlet, Copper River Basin, Tanana Valley, and a little bit of IFR on the Central Arctic Coast. For the afternoon, band of IFR pushes eastward with that next front across the Bering Sea to Adak, and then improving back to VFR behind it, Kiska to Shimia, and VFR in advance of that system too over the eastern Bering Sea, but still some marginal VFR for St. Lawrence Island, Seward Peninsula. IFR there, Kotzebue, and mostly right along or off the Arctic coast, and then a zone from the northeast interior southwestward to the lower Yukon Valley. VFR, central, south central Alaska, Northern Cook Inlet, IFR, Prince William Sound, and the Panhandle, North Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island. Anatuvik, IFR tomorrow, same thing for Adigan, especially on southern approach of both passes. And for Lake Clark and Merrill, IFR, occasional IFR for both passes there, occasional IFR for windy, or for rainy, windy, marginal VFR, higher conditions on the north entrance, and for Isabel, IFR, Mentasta, marginal, Tanita, IFR, becoming marginal VFR, a little bit of improvement through the day, Portage, IFR, and Chilkoot and White, VFR. Freezing levels, 2,000 feet over the northern and western interior, 4,000 feet across southern Alaska, and 6 to 10,000 feet across the southeast coast, 2,000 feet back south of the Aleutians, actually a fair ways south of the Aleutians. Icing, areas of considerable moderate icing possible for the North Gulf Coast and into areas of the southern Panhandle, otherwise just isolated moderate or mostly light from Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula, and the remainder of the southeast coast there. Pretty much icing free of any significance elsewhere around the state. And moving on to the winds aloft at 33,000 feet, pretty good trough, several low centers there from the western Arctic coast, right down the west coast there to the eastern Aleutians center there south of False Pass. Northerly winds there on the backside of that trough, 70 knots across the central Aleutians, a little bit stronger southwest of Shimianat-2, and then southwest winds at about 70 to 80 knots North Gulf Coast and across the Panhandle. And looking at 9,000 feet, again, it's trough about in the same position, northerlies 40 to 50 knots just west of the Pribilofs to Atka, and then 35 to 45 knot west-southwesterlies across the interior, west-southwest up to 50 knots there in the central north slope. 3,000 foot wind flow chart showing pretty light conditions over interior Alaska, even into the Gulf and Panhandle. Eastern Arctic coast, though, 35 knots west-southwest, 45 to 35 knot winds coming southward out of the north for the eastern Aleutians. And turbulence, light to isolated moderate chop, Fox Islands to Adak, and possibly there along the Alaska Range. And after the break, I'll be back with the marine forecasts.
Technology. It's the rhythm of our everyday life. We're more dependent on satellite and communication systems than at any other time in history. Disruptions can affect our economy and even our safety. To prepare for the effects of such events and minimize impacts, we need to look outside our atmosphere, some 93 million miles away, at a star we call the Sun. It's our main energy source. It warms the Earth and grows our food. While the sun and the space between may seem pleasant from our perspective, it's anything but peaceful. At its surface exists a chaotic state of eruptions and radiation. And unlike Vegas, what happens at the sun doesn't stay at the sun.
Space weather is essentially emissions from the sun, radiation, magnetic field that erupts from the solar surface, pumped out into space, sometimes right towards Earth. When it impacts the Earth, it impacts our technology. That's what we call space weather.
These solar events and their effects at Earth can disrupt systems we take for granted. From causing blackouts to the power grid, to delaying offshore drilling operations due to inaccurate GPS data. Interference with communication systems can force air traffic to reroute and impact rescue response and coordination. Outside our atmosphere, solar radiation can harm astronauts and the systems they depend on. The good news is that these eruptions can be detected early. Forecasters at the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, have their eyes on the sun at all times.
The Space Weather Prediction Center is part of the National Weather Service and is very much like a normal weather forecast office. We're here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're looking at data, we're looking at imagery, we're looking at model outputs. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches of imminent activity to our customers so they can take action.
In many ways, forecasting space weather is a lot like forecasting hurricanes. Those who rely on space weather forecasts, like electric power grid managers, are informed early on and can begin taking protective action.
When we see an eruption on the sun, space weather forecasters will issue a watch. This is much like a hurricane watch. When a hurricane sits offshore of Miami, for example, perhaps 48 hours out, we too can see way in advance that something may be coming towards the Earth.
As the storm moves toward us, it hits a monitoring spacecraft orbiting 1 million miles away from Earth.
It's kind of our buoy sitting out there offshore, and that hurricane, about 30, 45 minutes before it makes landfall, we'll get the measurements from the buoy. That's what this spacecraft does for us. That big eruption that left the sun hits the spacecraft. Now we've got the measurements of exactly what's going to impact us here on Earth, and we issue the warnings to give the power grid a heads up that the storm is now imminent. An interesting element to this whole process is that when the forecasters issue the alert, the power grid receives the alert, takes the necessary actions to protect the grid, and the average citizen never knows anything ever happened.
The number of customers who rely on space weather information continues to grow. As our reliance on technology increases, so will our need for constant monitoring of the sun.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
GPS has changed society. Most people don't realize how remarkable and how many different applications there are.
The GPS has become an integral part, not just of our daily lives as far as cell phones and guidance for our cars and mapping, but the whole system in agriculture is really relying heavily on high accuracy GPS.
So they're using GPS to plant those seeds with centimeter accuracy. And then they can come behind it and irrigate and fertilize right where that seed is with that 1 centimeter accuracy.
The GPS creates a line for the operator that he can steer along, or you go to another level and the operator doesn't steer anymore and the tractor has an automatic steering system on it, much like a cruise control on a car, except for when I push the button it doesn't drive a set speed. When I push a button it stays on a predefined line.
You don't even need lights. You can do it at nighttime. You program your GPS and it's driving that tractor for you. So it's huge, and it's changing the way that the farmers farm the fields.
6 or 7 days out.
There's an interest in GPS applications from space weather side because when the sun is eruptive, it causes GPS to falter, and in some cases it doesn't work at all.
Productivity may suffer to a certain degree in that there's no way that I as a human being can steer as good 8 hours a day as a GPS system's going to do. It's going to be the same all day long. Some of the other application technologies, those are going to be gone. We're not going to have the ability to do good section control on sprayers and planters and fertilizer applicators without GPS.
We see a huge growing customer base in so many different industries, so many different sectors now relying on GPS and high precision GPS. They're all big customers for us.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving on to marine forecasts of the southeast coast out along the outer coast for Monday. Southwest winds 15 knots on the south coast, seas 8 feet. And the north coast, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. Northern inside waters, Lynn Canal, south winds 20 knots, southeast 15 for Stevens Passage, and south winds at 20 knots for Clarence Strait. Then a big increase in the winds in store for Tuesday as that huge storm moves northward from the northeast Pacific into the close enough to affect the offshore areas. And we've got gale warnings all along the coast, winds increasing on the south coast, southerlies to 40 knots, seas building quite high as you can see there, up to 31 feet. And the north coast, even stronger winds, southeast 45 knots, seas building to 38 feet. Gale warnings developing for Clarence Strait in the afternoon, southeast winds 35 knots, central northern inside waters, south winds at 25 knots with 5-foot seas. And for the Prince William Sound zone, southeast winds 15 knots Monday, east-northeast winds 10 to 15 knots for Cook Inlet, south at 20 for Kamishak Bay, and small craft advisories for the Barren Islands, western North Gulf Coast, south winds 25 knots, south winds 20 knots for the Middleton Island area. Then on Tuesday, big increase in the winds here. Gale warnings, northeast 40 knot winds for the western North Gulf Coast, Barren Islands, north 40 knots for Kamishak Bay, east winds 45 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, and northeast winds 25 knots for northern Cook Inlet, or for Prince William Sound, north at 25 for northern Cook Inlet. Gale warnings south of the Forelands for north winds at 35 knots. Kodiak Island, Monday, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Alaska Peninsula, west-southwest at 15. Bristol Bay, southwest winds 15 knots. And then on Tuesday, you can see a storm warning there from Castle Cape to Sitkinak, northwest winds 50 knots. Kodiak Island, north winds 45 knots. Alaska Peninsula, northwesterlies at 30 to 35 knots. And Bristol Bay, north at 25 with 5-foot seas. Eastern Aleutians, northwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Central Aleutians, northwest at 30 knots Monday. And for the western Aleutians, westerlies at 30 knots. And then on Tuesday, ahead of that next front, really coming up there, storm force winds out of the southwest at 50 knots from Shemya all the way to Atka Island. And then we've got gale warnings for the eastern Aleutians, west-southwest winds 30 to 40 knots. And for the southwest coast, We've got for the Yukon Delta coast, northwest winds 30 knots Monday, northwest at 30 also for St. Matthew, St. Paul, and St. George Islands, seas around 11 feet. Kuskokwim Delta coast, southwest winds at 20 knots. St. Lawrence Island, northerly winds 25 knots with 9-foot seas. And for Tuesday, St. Lawrence Island, winds come down, northwest down to 15, north winds 20 to 25 knots for the southwest coast. But in the afternoon, St. Matthew Island, gale warnings, southeast winds increasing to 45 knots, seas building toward 20 feet, and the Pribilof, southwest winds 35 knots with 10-foot seas. Eastern Boulevard Sea Coast, south to southwest winds 15 to 25 knots, small craft advisories for the central coast, northeast at 30 knots, northeast 25 for the western Arctic coast and the Chukchi Sea, northeast winds at 20. And for Tuesday, Chukchi Sea, northwest at 15, western Arctic coast, east winds 15 knots, north 15 for the central coast, west winds 20 to 25 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, seas at about 5 feet. And for tonight again, low pressure along the Yukon Delta coast, and actually a trough all along the entire west coast down to the eastern Aleutians, keeps it cloudy and unsettled, areas of rain and snow. And then to the north of that, areas of snow, light snow and snow showers with light rain, fog, and drizzle for the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern Aleutians. Periods of light rain, Kodiak Island with fog up to the North Gulf Coast, showers south central Alaska, some light rain moving in across the Panhandle with that weakening trough. And tomorrow, showers over the northern Panhandle, dries out to the south again, and the eastern interior will be drier than the western interior. And areas of light snow for the Arctic coast. And then the next day, big intense low pressure area you can see with a very tight pressure field. In fact, probably hurricane force winds around the center. They're moving into the offshore area late in the afternoon, otherwise full gales along the southeast and North Gulf Coast. And Kodiak Island as well, with some storm warnings there, Sitkinak to Castle Cape. Rain on the increase, especially Kodiak and the eastern North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.